You won't believe what my own daughter said to me after I lost everything. After years of sacrifice. Raising her single-handedly, pouring every ounce of myself into giving her the best life I could. I showed up on her doorstep with nowhere else to turn. And she told me I ruined her aesthetic. That was the moment everything shifted. If she thought I'd just slink away without a word, she clearly never truly knew the woman who raised her. Subscribe if you believe in second chances, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I never imagined I'd end up on my daughter's doorstep clutching a suitcase in one hand and the ashes of my life in the other. The smell of smoke still clung to my clothes, stubborn as old regrets. My house had burned to the ground the night before. Every photograph, every keepsake, every piece of my past reduced to soot and silence. In that heavy silence, I stood before the girl I'd given everything to, hoping, praying, for a kindness I hadn't needed to ask for in decades. Her home was immaculate, one of those sleek new builds. Stone exterior, tall black door, perfectly arranged potted plants. It looked like it belonged on the cover of a lifestyle magazine. When she opened the door, the porch light framed her in a soft golden glow. She wore a crisp white cardigan over a silk blouse, not a single hair out of place. She didn't ask why I was there. Didn't glance at the suitcase or the soot staining my coat. She didn't even blink. She just looked me up and down like I was a mismatched throw pillow on her pristine beige sofa. Then she said it. "You can't stay here, Mom. You'd ruin the aesthetic." I don't remember what I muttered in response. Maybe nothing. But I remember the soft, final click of the door closing, like the period at the end of a brutally short sentence. That sound echoed in my head all night. I ended up at the Oakview Inn off the interstate. $28 a night. It smelled of damp carpet and mildew, but it had a bed, a lamp, and a cracked mirror that barely reflected me. Maybe that was a blessing. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, staring at the phone in my lap. I wanted to call someone, anyone. But there was no one left. I'd raised Emily alone. Her father walked out when she was 10, leaving me with a mortgage, a little girl, and a rusty Buick that refused to start in the rain. I worked double shifts, days waiting tables at the diner, nights sewing alterations at a tailor shop, just to keep the lights on. I never remarried. I didn't have the time, and I refused to bring another man into my daughter's life unless I was certain he'd stay. None ever did. Emily excelled. Straight A's, full scholarship to college. She became a nutritionist, married a plastic surgeon, and moved to Charleston. New car, new house, new polished circle of friends. I was proud of her. But with every rung she climbed on that ladder of perfection, it felt like she drifted a little further from me. Still, I never dreamed she'd shut the door in my face when I had nowhere else to go. That night in the motel I cried, quietly, so the thin walls wouldn't carry the sound. I'm not a crier. Not when I lost my job. Not even when I buried my sister with no family beside me. But that night, the tears came until my throat burned. Because for the first time I understood the awful truth. I'd become inconvenient. An eyesore. A smudge on the flawless canvas of her curated life. The next morning I took a long walk. My feet carried me back to Oakwood Terrace, the old neighborhood where I'd raised Emily in a modest two-bedroom house with a chain-link fence and a backyard full of dandelions. I hadn't been there in years. That's when I spotted Velma on her porch, shelling peas into a big metal bowl just like she used to decades ago. She squinted, then let out a booming laugh that sent birds fluttering from the trees. "Maggie Walker," she hollered, hopping up as spry as ever. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't spill everything at first, just enough to say I was staying at the Oakview, needing some air, figuring things out. But Velma's eyes were too sharp. "You're not figuring anything out, sugar," she said. "You're just trying not to fall apart." We talked for hours, old stories, lost years, our daughters, time slipping away like wild horses. Then, as always, Velma cut straight to the heart. "You've still got fight in you, Maggie. You just forgot how to throw a punch." I didn't sleep that night. Lying in the lumpy motel bed, I thought about everything I'd sacrificed for Emily. Every dream I postponed, every priority that came second to her. And now I wasn't even worthy of a place on her couch. At 3 a.m., I pulled out the little black notebook I kept in my purse, the one where I'd quietly tracked every extra dollar I'd managed to save over the years. Side jobs, careful investments, sewing money tucked away. I added it all up. It was just enough. Not for revenge, but for something far better. 2 weeks later I found the house. Grand white columns, sweeping wraparound porch, sweeping views of the marsh. The listing called it, a Southern Belle's Dream. Emily had once circled a photo of a nearly identical house in a magazine when she was younger and declared, "One day, I'm going to live in a place just like this." I bought it outright. In cash. Then I snapped a photo. Fresh white paint, manicured lawn, the red for sale sign still in the yard. I texted it to her. No caption. Just the picture. Less than 5 minutes later my phone rang. "Mom." Her voice was tight, uncertain. "Why did you send me a photo of that house?" "Because I bought it," I said calmly. Silence. "It's yours," I continued. "Or it could be. But I'm thinking of putting it back on the market." "Why?" she whispered, voice trembling. "Why would you do that?" "Because, sweetheart," I replied, steadier than I'd felt in years, "it fits your aesthetic perfectly." I hung up before she could respond. And for the first time in years I smiled. But what I didn't know then, what I couldn't possibly have known, was that this wasn't just about a house. This was the start of something far larger. Something that would shatter us both before it could ever hope to heal us. Secrets were buried deep, and they were about to surface. I was going to learn that Emily hadn't been the only one keeping things hidden all these years. She didn't call that night. I'd half expected her to. Maybe to yell, maybe to beg, maybe to accuse me of cruelty. But nothing came. Only silence, thick and heavy, like fog rolling through an old graveyard, hiding everything unsaid. I spent one more night at the Oakview Inn. The mattress seemed to sag even lower, and the vending machine's hum outside my door felt louder, more insistent. I lay awake staring at the water-stained ceiling, letting the quiet stretch. For once I wasn't the one waiting. I was the one holding the reins. The next morning I returned to the house I'd bought. It perched proudly on its gentle hill, wide porches wrapping around it like welcoming arms, perfect for lazy Sunday mornings with coffee and conversation. I walked through the empty rooms slowly, listening to the old hardwood floors creak beneath my feet, as if they were waking up after a long sleep. The air carried the faint scent of lemon polish mixed with something older, history waiting patiently for a new chapter. In the dining room. A crystal chandelier caught the sunlight and scattered tiny rainbows across the walls. I pictured Emily there, at the head of the long table, glass of wine in hand, playing the perfect hostess. I wondered if she'd ever see this place as more than the photo I'd sent. Then I heard tires on the gravel driveway. I was in the sunroom, nursing a lukewarm coffee from a paper cup, when the sound came. I didn't move. I just waited. A minute later the front door opened. She'd used the key I'd mailed her 2 days earlier, tucked inside a small velvet pouch. "Mama." Her voice was small, uncertain. I stayed quiet. Her heels clicked across the floors like sharp, hesitant footsteps. She found me at last. She looked like sleep had evaded her. Eyes red-rimmed and puffy, hair a little frizzled at the edges, none of her usual flawless polish. "You really bought it?" she asked, glancing around as if the house might disappear. I nodded. "Why?" I leaned back in the wicker chair. "You told me I ruined your aesthetic. So I found one that might suit you better." Her face flickered hurt, then defense. She straightened. "This isn't funny, Mom." "I'm not laughing. I sent you a picture of the house you always dreamed of, then let you think I might sell it. You seem to like signs." She blinked hard. "Is this revenge?" "No," I said softly. "It's a mirror." We sat in heavy silence for a long time. Finally she whispered, "You don't understand how my life is now. Everything is curated, structured. There's a look, a standard, a place for everything. And you don't fit." I met her eyes. "I didn't raise you to fit in, Emily. I raised you to stand out." She looked away. "That's why you've been rewriting the past, isn't it?" I asked quietly. Her head snapped back. "What are you talking about? You told everyone your father walked out and never looked back. But that's not the whole truth, is it?" Her lips parted but no sound came. I stood, walked to a drawer I'd stocked the day before with the contents of an old box salvaged from the fire, and pulled out a worn envelope. The corners were bent, the paper soft from years of handling. I handed it to her. She hesitated, then took it. Her fingers shook as she opened it and began to read. It was a letter from her father, written 8 years after he'd left us. He'd begged to come back, Said he'd found faith, purpose, the strength to be the man we deserved. He'd even come to the door twice but hadn't been allowed inside. Her lips moved silently as she read. Then her legs seemed to give way, and she sank onto the nearest couch. I told him to leave, she whispered, more to herself than to me. He called when I was 16. I answered. He wanted to see us both. I told him we didn't need him anymore. I thought I was protecting you. My heart pounded. You were angry. I'd worked myself to the bone. He'd left me with everything to carry alone. You wanted to punish him. She nodded, tears spilling over. So I erased him. I never told you. I was afraid you'd never forgive me. I sat beside her and reached for her hand. She flinched at first, then let me take it. There's more than one way to burn a home down, Emily, I said gently. Sometimes it isn't fire. Sometimes it's just silence. We sat there a long while, the weight of all those unspoken years pressing on us. At last she said, voice small, I don't deserve this house. That's not for me to decide. She looked up, eyes searching mine. What if I want to earn it? I didn't answer right away. I just gazed out the window at the overgrown garden, wildflowers pushing defiantly through the cracks. Then we'd have to start over, I said finally. And it won't be easy. I don't want easy, she said, her voice cracking. I want you back. Something inside me softened. But another part, the part that still remembered standing on her perfect porch in soot-stained clothes, watching that door close, held steady. Then don't just say it, I whispered. Show me. She nodded, tears streaming in that moment. The first brick in the wall between us cracked. But as I would soon discover, the house wasn't the only thing hiding secrets. There was one more envelope in that old box, buried at the very bottom. I didn't notice it until the day after Emily left, promising through her tears that she would try. It was yellowed, sealed with brittle tape, waiting patiently for decades like it knew exactly when its time would come. I found it the next morning, sitting at the little breakfast nook where the sunlight poured in just right. Outside, the wind tugged at the for sale sign I still hadn't removed. Maybe part of me wanted it to stay a little longer, a reminder, a dare. When I finally opened the envelope, the handwriting stopped my heart cold. It was his. Daniel's. I hadn't seen that sharp, slanted script in over 30 years, but I'd have known it anywhere, hurried, impatient, like he was already halfway out the door even on paper. The letter was dated just 4 years ago. 4 years. 4. Not decades ago. Not some faded memory from the era of cassette tapes and rotary phones. This was recent, only 4 years old. Maggie, if this ever reaches you, it means I finally worked up the courage to try one more time. I have no right to ask anything of you, but for the past 10 years I've been trying to make amends with the man I was. I was a coward. Fear and failure swallowed me whole. Leaving you and Emily was the biggest mistake I ever made. I tried to come back twice. Emily wouldn't let me in. She told me you were better off without me, that you'd moved on, and that I'd only cause more hurt. I stopped reading. My hand shook so badly the paper rattled. Tears blurred the words. I could picture her at 16, sharp-tongued, bristling with teenage pride, fiercely protective of me, furious at the world for forcing her to grow up too fast. But she'd hidden this from me. For years. I pressed the letter to my chest and rocked gently in the chair, a pain blooming inside that had no name. It wasn't quite betrayal, it was grief reborn. When I forced myself to finish, I learned Daniel had remarried briefly, no children. His wife died of cancer. Afterward, he'd moved to Tennessee, lived quietly, worked in a used bookstore, and wrote letters he never mailed. The final line broke me. If I don't see you again in this life, know that I never stopped loving you. And I never stopped hoping for one more chance. I had to find him. I wasn't sure why, not exactly. Maybe for closure. Maybe to look him in the eye and decide once and for all if anything remained between us. Velma noticed the change first. That old spark's back in your eyes, she said, leaning over the fence with a cigarette dangling from her fingers. You fixin' to go somewhere? Tennessee, I replied, folding laundry on the porch. Few days. Maybe longer. She arched a brow. That where the skeletons are hid? I gave a faint smile. No. But maybe it's where I left a piece of myself. 3 days later I hit the road alone, My first solo trip in decades. Windows down, radio soft, I drove through small towns with unpronounceable names and stopped at diners where the coffee was strong enough to raise the dead. By the time I reached the address, dusk was settling. The little one-story house had faded blue shutters and a for rent sign stabbed into the lawn. My heart sank. I knocked anyway. A woman in her 40s answered, looking puzzled when I asked for Daniel Walker. He passed last spring, she said gently. I'm the landlord now. The ground seemed to vanish beneath me. Pancreatic cancer, she added. It was quick. Less than 3 months after the diagnosis. I couldn't breathe. I didn't cry. I just stood there numb. Then she asked, Are you Maggie? I blinked. Yes. Her face softened. He talked about you constantly. Said you were the one that got away. She invited me in. He left something for you. The house smelled of old books and lemon oil. On a shelf by the window sat a small wooden box carved with tiny birds. Inside were old photos of me and Emily, a pressed flower from our wedding day, and one final letter, shorter this time. You were my lighthouse, even when I drifted farthest. I hope you found the happiness you deserved. I hope you always knew deep down that I never stopped loving you. And if there's still a chance, wherever I am now, I'll be waiting. I don't remember the drive home. Only that the sun was rising when I pulled into the driveway of the new house. Emily's car was already there. She sat on the porch steps, knees hugged to her chest, mascara streaked down her cheeks. When I stepped out, she stood but said nothing. I walked up slowly, Daniel's last letter still in my coat pocket. I know, she said before I could speak. I know about the letter. I know you know everything. I nodded. Why, Emily? I thought I was protecting you, she whispered. I thought he didn't deserve you. I was wrong. I see that now. I studied her face, really looked, and for the first time in years, I saw the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, certain I could fix the world. I forgave him, I said quietly. She let out a broken sob. Can you forgive me? I didn't answer right away. Real forgiveness isn't instant lightning. It's a slow, steady rain. Takes time to soak in. And I needed her to feel the weight of it, to earn it the way I'd carried her all those years. The truth was finally out in the open, but our story wasn't finished. Redemption isn't handed over. It's built one careful brick at a time. And I knew exactly how we could begin. With paint. Not fancy wallpaper or marble counters, just simple honest paint. Soft white for the walls, warm yellow in the kitchen, gentle lavender in the bedrooms. Colors that welcomed you home instead of showing you off. Emily rolled the first coat in the living room herself, hair twisted up in a messy knot, sleeves pushed high. By the end of the day, her designer manicure was chipped and speckled, and she didn't even care. She was trying. I could feel it in every careful stroke, every quiet moment she lingered in a room. She wasn't moving in as the flawless new owner. She was learning slowly what it truly meant to belong. The grand house, once a cold symbol of perfection, started to breathe. Heavy curtains came down. Sleek Art Deco fixtures gave way to warm Edison bulbs. She even let Velma pick the kitchen backsplash. Lord help us all. We worked side by side, me, Velma, and a handful of old neighbors who hadn't seen Emily since her awkward braces days. They didn't come for her. They came for what the house was turning into. Not just a home but a haven. We called it Rose Harbor. A transitional residence for older women discarded by their families, abandoned by partners, or simply overlooked by a world that decided they'd outlived their usefulness. Women like me. Like Velma. Like far too many others with nowhere left to go. It was Emily's idea. One evening as we painted the old porch swing a rich teal, she said quietly, I want to fix what I broke, Mama. Not just between us. I want to make space for women like you, like the woman you were when you had nothing. I want to be someone who opens doors instead of closing them. I didn't answer right away. I just kept brushing on the paint, stroke after steady stroke. But deep inside, a tight knot I'd carried for years began to loosen. 3 months later, Rose Harbor opened its doors. We held a simple gathering on the front lawn, plastic folding chairs, pitchers of lemonade, trays of peach cobbler, and a scrappy band of high school kids playing from the porch steps. I wore the same navy dress I'd worn to Emily's college graduation. It still fit. Emily stood on the porch and spoke to the small crowd, her voice trembling. "My mother built an entire life for me when she had nothing," she said. "And when she needed me most, when all she asked for was a place to lay her head, I turned her away. I was cruel. I was selfish." She could have answered with anger, but instead she gave me a gift I didn't deserve. Today I'm not just asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to earn it. The lawn went quiet. Then one person clapped. Then another. Soon everyone was applauding, some through tears. I sat in my chair and cried silently, dabbing my eyes with a napkin that smelled faintly of barbecue sauce. Later, after the sun had set and the last guest left, I sat on the porch steps watching stars appear one by one. Emily brought me a glass of iced tea, settled beside me, and rested her head on my shoulder, just like she did when she was small. "You were right," she whispered. "A house doesn't make a home." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded deed, already transferred into her name months earlier. "I already gave this to you," I said softly, "but I need you to truly understand what that means." She stared at the paper. "You get the house," I continued, "but Rose Harbor stays. The women stay. The mission stays." She nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I won't let you down again." I squeezed her hand. "Then we'll be just fine." A week later, an unmarked envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a photograph. Daniel and me at a summer picnic when Emily was 3. We were gazing at each other as if the rest of the world didn't exist. On the back, in his familiar slanted handwriting, were 6 simple words. "You made it home." I knew. I never learned who sent it. Maybe a former coworker from the bookstore. Maybe something bigger. All I know is that it felt like closure carried gently on the wind. The house is never silent now. Laughter echoes through the hallways. Stories unfold in rocking chairs on the wide porch. Sometimes women dance in the kitchen at midnight, barefoot and free. There are scars here, yes, but also healing. And grace. Emily still gets sharp when she's tired. That fire never fully leaves her. But she laughs more easily now. Hugs me longer. And when she introduces me to new residents, she says, "This is my mother, Margaret. She's the reason any of this exists." I smile every time. Because it's true. I was never a perfect mother. But I was hers. And in the end, that was enough to build something lasting, something beautiful that didn't just match an aesthetic. Something that saved us both. It had been exactly 6 days since Emily's confession on the porch, 6 days since she finally said the words I'd waited 30 years to hear. "I want you back." But what no one knew, not even Emily, was that I wasn't quite ready to come all the way back yet. Healing isn't only about gluing the pieces together. Sometimes it's about sitting with the shards long enough to understand how they broke. For me, that meant returning to the very beginning. I hadn't driven through Oakwood Terrace in nearly 10 years. But on the 7th morning, I found myself turning onto its familiar cracked streets, past overgrown lots and leaning mailboxes. That neighborhood raised me as much as I raised Emily. Beneath its peeling paint and sagging porches lay answers I hadn't realized I still needed. The little house where I'd brought Emily home from the hospital was still standing, barely. Paint gone, fence tired and leaning. But the old magnolia tree in the front yard, the one she used to climb every summer, had grown taller and stronger, bursting with white blossoms like tiny promises. I stepped out of the car and simply stood there, breathing it in. That's when I saw her. Mrs. Loretta Mason from across the street in the old days. She had to be 80-something now, but she sat on her porch in a wide-brimmed hat, sipping tea with the same quiet elegance time had never managed to dim. "Maggie Walker," she called, voice carrying clear across the street. "Is that really you?" I laughed through the sudden lump in my throat and crossed over to her. We talked for hours about the neighborhood, the years, the way life changes us. Then, out of nowhere, she said something that stopped me cold. "I always wondered what really happened between you and Daniel." I stared at her. "What do you mean?" She took a slow sip of tea. "I saw him. A few years after he left, he came knocking on my door, asking if I knew where you'd moved. Said he was trying to find his girls." My heart hammered in my chest. "You never told me any of this." Mrs. Loretta looked down at her teacup, guilt flickering across her face. "I didn't want to reopen old wounds, sugar. But seeing you now, I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe you deserve to know he tried to come back." That was the second person who told me Daniel had returned looking for us. And in that moment everything finally clicked. Emily hadn't just shut the door on her father. She'd buried the truth, every trace of it, out of pain, out of fear, perhaps even out of a fierce, misguided love. But in doing so, she'd left me living inside a false version of my own history for decades. I drove back to the big house, the one I'd bought with the sweeping porch and tall white columns, the one where the for sale sign still leaned crookedly in the yard, battered by the wind. When I stepped inside, the air felt thick, almost heavy with everything unspoken. Whether it was memory or truth finally settling into the walls, I'm not sure. But I knew exactly what I had to do next. I climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. Few people even knew it existed, not even Emily. It was hidden behind a small door at the end of the upstairs hallway. The space was raw and dusty, with exposed beams and the faint scent of cedar and old time. That's where I found the box that I hadn't touched it since the week after the fire. The one that destroyed my old rental and sent me, suitcase in hand, to Emily's doorstep. The box had survived because it was in the trunk of my car with the few things I'd managed to save. I'd quietly stashed it here when I moved in, never unpacking it. Inside were faded photos, old letters, receipts from a lifetime ago, and one folded sheet of notebook paper, edges torn and soft with age. Emily's handwriting. Mom, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. You loved me so fiercely that I never learned how to love you back the same way. Every accomplishment I had felt like a debt I could never repay. Every mistake you made felt like a scab I couldn't stop picking. I didn't truly understand what you sacrificed for me until it was far too late. My legs gave way. I sank to the dusty attic floor beside the open box and cried, deep, wrenching sobs that shook me to the core. Because for the first time I saw her clearly, not as the polished woman who'd closed the door in my face, but as the frightened, overburdened girl I'd raised. A girl carrying pain every bit as heavy as mine. Only hers had built walls, while mine had created distance. That night I didn't call her. Instead, I walked outside and pulled the leaning for sale sign from the ground. The next morning I visited a lawyer. I signed the deed over to Emily, but not as a simple gift of property. It came with a binding condition. The house must become a non-profit residence for women over 60 who'd been displaced, rejected, or left with nowhere else to turn. It wasn't punishment. It was purpose. I mailed the papers to her with a short note. Your aesthetic doesn't define your worth, sweetheart. But maybe now it can help restore someone else's. The following day there was a knock at the door. Emily stood on the porch. No makeup, no carefully curated outfit, just red-rimmed eyes and the signed folder trembling in her hand. I want to help them, she said, voice breaking. And I want to start with you. In that instant the door that had once slammed shut swung wide open. Not just for us, but for so many others who needed it. There's a quiet moment just before dawn when the sky turns a deep velvety blue and the whole world seems to pause, suspended between night and morning, holding its breath. That's when I often stand on the wide front porch of Rose Harbor, coffee steaming in my hands, watching mist drift in from the marsh. The house is peaceful then. Inside, the first residents sleep in rooms we prepared with care. Sandra, evicted from her son's home after a broken hip, made her too much trouble. Denise, a retired teacher who lived in her car for nearly a year after her husband emptied their savings and disappeared. They aren't numbers or sad stories to me. They are mirrors, and they were only the beginning. Emily took the papers and ran with them. She hired a nonprofit consultant, met with city officials, partnered with social workers. She even started a small fund for initial expenses. Every step, every decision she brought to me first. Does this feel right, Mama? She'd ask, eyes searching mine. I never thought I'd hear those words from her again. Between meetings, she scrubbed floors, painted secondhand furniture, drove the old donated church van across town for pickup loads of bedding and dishes. And each evening she asked real questions, the kind that dig deep. What did you dream of before I came along? Did you ever want to pack up and run? Did raising me make you happy? That last one stole my breath. I looked her straight in the eye. You were the hardest and the best thing that ever happened to me. She didn't look away. She just nodded. That's when I knew she was truly changing. And perhaps finally so was I. But the past wasn't finished with us yet. 3 weeks after Rose Harbor officially opened, my phone rang with an unfamiliar Nashville number. My stomach nodded. Hello? Is this Margaret Walker? Yes. This is awkward. I'm so sorry to call out of the blue. I was Daniel's hospice nurse. I cared for him at the end. He asked me to contact you if we ever found your information. I lowered myself slowly into a chair, pulse racing. He talked about you every single day, she said gently. But there's something else. He wanted you to have this. 2 days later, a small brown paper package arrived. Inside was a worn leather journal, spine cracked, pages soft with age. On the very first page, in Daniel's bold, unmistakable script, to the woman who carried me in her heart, even when I was too lost to find my way back. I didn't open it right away. I waited until nightfall when the house was hushed, the tea was hot, and the lamps glowed low. Emily sat cross-legged on the rug across from me, patient and quiet, waiting. Together we read every word. His regrets poured out, raw and unfiltered. The memories he'd clung to. The exact moment he chose to walk away. The times he tried to return. The letters he wrote but never mailed. The afternoon he stood in the shadows outside Emily's high school graduation, watching from afar because he wasn't sure he had the right to step closer. He'd seen us. All those years he'd never stopped seeing us, even from a distance. At the very end of the journal he'd written, "If this ever reaches you, it means I finally got one thing right. Tell Emily I never stopped loving her. Tell her I forgave her long ago. Tell her I understand." Emily pressed her forehead to the open pages and cried. Not the tears of a child or a broken adult, but the deep releasing sobs of someone finally set free from a burden she'd carried alone. We buried the journal beneath the old magnolia tree in the backyard, beside the soft blue bench we'd painted together. We didn't mark the spot. We didn't need to. Some things are meant to rest quietly in the earth. Time moved on, more women arrived, each with her own heavy suitcases, not of clothes but of stories. And every time one of them whispered, "I didn't think anyone would take me in," something inside my chest grew a little wider. Emily became their fierce advocate. I became the keeper of their stories. And together we became something we'd never quite managed before. Whole point one quiet evening on the porch swing, her feet tucked under a quilt, my hand resting over hers, she asked, "Do you think he knows what we've built here?" I looked at the house glowing warmly from within. Laughter drifted from an open window. Someone was playing soft jazz in the parlor. "I think he does," I said. And I believed it. Because redemption rarely announces itself with trumpets. Sometimes it simply looks like a weary woman stepping through the door with trembling hands and finding fresh sheets, a warm meal, and a note on her pillow that reads, "You are home." We saved each other, my daughter and I, not by erasing the past, but by rising from its ashes. I've learned this. The most beautiful things in life rarely match anyone's perfect aesthetic. They just feel like they belong. Like love. Like truth. Like finally coming home after the longest road. 3 months after Rose Harbor opened, word had traveled far beyond Charleston. Local news called it a southern sanctuary for the forgotten. Donations flooded in: furniture, books, crisp new linens. One man delivered 5 brand new mattresses with tears in his eyes, murmuring, "My mother died alone. I wish she'd had a place like this." But the real magic wasn't in the porch swing or the flower beds or the curtains Emily sewed by hand. It was in the women themselves. Women who'd been told they were too loud, too needy, too much trouble. Women left behind by children, husbands, or simply by time. One of them was Ruth, 82, once a jazz singer in smoky clubs. 2 strokes had taken much of her strength. Her only remaining family, a nephew, hadn't called in years. She arrived in a wheelchair with one small bag, and a bottle of inexpensive perfume tucked in the pocket. "I heard you take in women like me," she said. "I don't have much left, but I can still carry a tune." We welcomed her that same night. Ruth became the heartbeat of Rose Harbor. She sang over breakfast, spun wild tales of nightclub nights and romances with saxophone players. The other women gathered around her like moths to a gentle flame. She reminded me of something I'd nearly forgotten. Joy isn't merely surviving. The singing anyway. Emily adored her. Every Thursday evening she sat with Ruth, brushing her silver hair, listening to the same stories repeated with patience and wonder, never hurrying her along. I'd watch from the hallway and sometimes, just sometimes, I glimpsed the daughter I'd always prayed she'd become. But not every day was gentle. One night Ruth collapsed in the hallway, breathing shallow, eyes fluttering. Emily froze. I didn't. I knelt beside her, dialed for help, held her hand until the paramedics arrived. As they wheeled her out, Ruth looked up at me with glassy eyes and whispered, "Don't let me go in silence." Neither Emily nor I slept that night. We sat at the kitchen table like we had when she was small and afraid of storms, clutching mugs of tea we never drank. "She's dying," Emily said, voice hollow. "She's living," I replied. "Right up until her last breath, we treat her like she still matters." Emily stared at me, eyes wide with old fears. I was so scared. For a moment she looked just like you. And in that instant I understood. This wasn't only about Ruth or the house or even Daniel. It was about the terror Emily had carried for decades. The dread that one day I'd be gone, leaving her alone with nothing but regret. That fear had once made her shut the door on me. Now it was making her brave. Ruth survived the night and the days that followed. 5 days later she returned with an oxygen tank and a playlist of Ella Fitzgerald we played every afternoon. She was friendlier, quieter, but still unmistakably Ruth. On her final morning she asked for one thing. "Let me go out singing." We dressed her in a soft blue velvet robe, settled her on the porch swing with a blanket over her legs. As the sun began to rise, she sang the opening lines of Misty, her voice trembling yet true. By the last note she had slipped away. Emily held her hand the entire time. We scattered Ruth's ashes in the garden beneath the rosebush planted in her memory. Each woman placed a flower on the soil. Emily read a poem she'd written herself. And I wept openly, not just for Ruth, but for every woman who'd ever been told she was too much or not enough. That night, Emily climbed into my bed as she had when she was 5. No words. Just tears, silence, and the fierce, wordless love that has nowhere else to go. I held her until she slept. The next morning, I found her in the sunroom, coffee cooling in her hands, gazing out the window. "I want to write about this place," she said quietly. "The women. The stories. All of it." I smiled. "Then start with your own." She turned to me, uncertain. "You think anyone would want to hear it?" I leaned in and kissed her forehead. "Emily Walker," I said, "your story is the one that built these walls." And I meant every word. Because in the end it wasn't vengeance that healed me. It wasn't the grand house or the hidden letters. It was watching my daughter choose not just to apologize but to change. And through that change she gave me the one thing no one else ever had. Not merely a second chance, but the full, rich life I was always meant to live. A week after Ruth's quiet funeral, I sat alone in the sunroom sorting through the latest donation boxes. Crocheted blankets, soft robes, a note from a church group in Savannah. Every stitch made with love. I pressed one of the blankets to my chest. It smelled faintly of lavender and distant memories. 4 months had passed since I'd bought this house. 4 months since Emily told me I ruined her aesthetic. 4 months since my world burned down and somehow, through all the ashes and heartache, found its way to exactly where it belonged. But peace, I've learned, has a way of surprising you. Peace arrives quietly without fireworks or fanfare. It slips in during the moments you're not watching for it. Like the morning Velma burst through the kitchen door, waving the Charleston Gazette like a victory flag. "Guess who's front page news again, sugar?" She slapped the paper down on the table. There we were, me, Emily, and a circle of women from Rose Harbor, arms linked on the wide front porch, grinning like we'd just won something priceless. The headline read, "From Rejection to Redemption. The Home-Changing Lives in Charleston." I stared at the photo longer than I needed to. Not because I enjoyed seeing myself, I still didn't, but because the woman looking back barely resembled the one I'd known for years. It wasn't the silver in my hair or the lines around my eyes. It was the light in them. I looked happy. That afternoon, a hesitant knock sounded at the door. It wasn't a delivery or a social worker. It was a lanky teenage boy, maybe 16, shifting nervously on the porch, clutching a worn envelope. "You Margaret?" he asked. I nodded. He thrust the envelope into my hands and bolted down the steps before I could say a word. Inside was a handwritten letter in careful, youthful script. "Mrs. Walker, you don't know me, but I knew your husband. Daniel worked with my mom at the bookstore. He talked about you all the time. Said you were the strongest woman he'd ever met. He gave me this letter months before he passed and told me to deliver it. When the time feels right. I didn't get it until I saw the article about Rose Harbor today. Now I do. I hope this brings you peace. My hand shook as I unfolded the second sheet. Daniel's handwriting shakier now, the strokes thinner, but unmistakably his. Maggie, if you're reading this, someone braver than I ever was got it to you. I wish I could sit beside you, hold your hand and say this in person. But life rarely hands us the endings we dream of. Only the ones we build. I know what I did. I know what I left behind. And I know I never earned your forgiveness. Yet you loved me anyway. I see it now, in this house you've made, in what you're building. You took rejection and turned it into refuge. You took pain and gave it purpose. You took our broken, unfinished story and made it beautiful. I'm sorry I couldn't stay. But in some quiet way, you've brought us all home. Always yours, D. I pressed the letter to my heart and let the tears come. Not the sharp, shattering kind, but the gentle ones that wash things clean. That night, under a high, bright moon that scented the air with gardenia, I called Emily outside. I handed her the letter. She read it in silence, one hand over her mouth. When she finished, she leaned her head on my shoulder, small again like the little girl she once was. I wish I'd known him better, she whispered. You still can, I said. Through this. Through us. We sat there until the stars began to fade into dawn. And in that hush, I knew we'd made it. Not by forgetting the hurt, not by pretending it never happened, but by carrying it forward with grace, with stubborn grit, and with the quiet certainty that it's never too late to turn broken things into something good. Rose Harbor still stands. Women still arrive. Bags in hand, hearts wary, eyes holding equal parts fear and hope. And every time, I open the door with a smile and say, welcome home. Because I've learned the deepest truth. Redemption doesn't knock. Sometimes you have to build the house yourself and leave the door wide open. It was an ordinary Wednesday when we unpacked the last box in the library. A room we once thought we'd never fill. Now it overflowed with donated books, mismatched armchairs, a slightly offbeat grandfather clock, and sunlight spilling through the windows like mercy itself. I trailed my fingers along the shelves. Worn romance novels, dog-eared self-help books, faded cookbooks, even a first edition To Kill a Mockingbird with Gloria. Scrawled inside the cover. I smiled. Stories outlive us. Emily slipped in behind me, carrying a mug of chamomile tea and a thick folder tucked under her arm. Her cheeks were flushed. Not with makeup but with something deeper. Purpose. She handed me the folder. Inside were the final state documents. Rose Harbor Incorporated. Officially certified as a transitional living nonprofit. It's real now, she said, biting her lip to hold back tears. I touched the papers gently. You were always real, I whispered. You just had to remember. We spent the afternoon hanging framed portraits in the hallway. Every woman who'd stayed with us, her name etched beneath her photo. Not just to remember them but to see them. Truly see them. Proof that second chances can take root and bloom. Velma showed up with a tray of lemon bars and her usual sharp affection. Y'all gonna cry every time you hang a picture? She teased. Probably, I admitted, grinning. Good, she said firmly. Means your hearts haven't turned to stone yet. That evening I stood before the mirror in my bedroom. Not fussing with hair or clothes, just looking. Really looking. For the first time in decades I didn't see a woman who'd been left, rejected, or forgotten. I saw someone whole. That's when I remembered the old list. Tucked in the back of a journal years ago, titled When I Have a Home Again. I rummaged through drawers until I found it. The paper was fragile, the ink faded, but the words remained. A porch swing that creaks. A kitchen full of noise. Laughter in the halls. Music at night. Peace in my bones. A daughter who sees me. Every box checked. I folded it carefully, slipped it between two books on the shelf, and walked back into the hallway. That's when I saw her. Emily standing by the front door, hands in her sweater pockets, watching dusk settle through the glass. When she turned, her eyes were soft with tears, grateful ones. She reached for my hand, held it like something precious. I found something today, she said quietly. She led me to the office and handed me a fresh envelope, postmarked from Tennessee. No return address. Inside was a black and white photograph. Daniel, me, and 3-year-old Emily perched on his shoulders. All three of us laughing, sunlight bright around us. On the back, in unfamiliar blocky handwriting, just 6 words. Thank you for bringing him home too. She turned out just fine. No signature, no explanation, just one last gentle nudge from the universe. I smiled, not because everything suddenly made perfect sense, but because it didn't have to. Life rarely ties itself up with pretty bows. It twists, frays, bends in directions we never expect. But if we're fortunate, and if we're brave, it hands us quiet chances to mend what we thought was gone forever. That night, we placed candles in every window. Not to mourn the dead, but to light the way for the living. For every woman still traveling a hard road. Still searching, still daring to hope. The porch filled with soft voices, easy laughter, hands clasped beneath warm blankets. Someone strummed a guitar. The air carried the comforting scent of fresh cornbread and cinnamon. And I thought, this is the ending I never knew to wish for, yet it's the one I earned, not through flawlessness but through stubborn resilience, raw truth, and a love that refused to quit, even when it was told it didn't belong. Emily caught my eye across the glow of candlelight. "Mama," she said softly, "you built this." I shook my head. "We built this. And that's how you reclaim your story. Not by scrubbing out the pain, but by filling the silence it left with voices that declare, you still matter. You are not alone. You are home. It was a crisp fall morning when I discovered the letter tucked beneath the porch swing pillow. I almost sat right on it. I'd slipped outside early before sunrise, wrapped in my faded flannel robe, ready to sip coffee and listen to the familiar creak of the swing, just as I did every peaceful morning now. But when I settled back, something crinkled beneath me. A plain envelope. No stamp, no address. Just my name in simple script. Margaret. I held it for a long while, listening to the first bird stir and the occasional car whisper down the distant road. Inside, the house slept. Emily, the other women. Everyone rested under that rare, golden calm that sometimes settles over Rose Harbor like a blessing. I opened it with steady fingers. A single typed sheet on formal letterhead. Franklin and Maynard, attorneys at law. My heart dipped at first. I feared old unfinished business from Daniel. Some legal snag over the nonprofit, the house, a complication I hadn't foreseen. But it wasn't trouble. It was a gift. The letter explained that Daniel's modest estate, a small pension, royalties from an unfinished book project, and a life insurance policy, had named me primary beneficiary. More than that, he'd set aside a generous portion to be transferred directly to Rose Harbor, under a clause he'd written himself, for the continuation of the love that was never lost, only misplaced. I pressed a hand to my mouth and cried right there on the swing, letter clutched against my heart. He hadn't forgotten. In his quiet, careful way, he'd prepared. Daniel had found his way home, too. Later that day, I showed Emily. She said nothing at first, just wrapped her arms around me so fiercely I could barely breathe. Then barely audible. "He never stopped trying to make it right, did he?" "No," I whispered back. "And neither did you." With the inheritance, we grew Rose Harbor, added 2 more bedrooms, a larger communal kitchen, and a small sunlit writing room overlooking the marsh. Emily's idea that we named it Daniel's room, not out of guilt but out of hope. Word spread quickly. Within weeks, applications lined up. Grants arrived. A reporter from the New York Times even called. Emily handled it all with a calm grace I'd rarely seen in her before. Clipboard in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose. My daughter, no longer bound by pride or the need for perfection, now led with quiet purpose. One evening we hosted a candlelight dinner. Residents, volunteers, old friends from town. Even Velma wore lipstick. As bowls of mashed potatoes and cornbread made their way around the long table, someone asked, "What do you really call this place? A shelter? A home?" I glanced at Emily and smiled. She answered for us both. "This," she said simply, "is redemption." The table fell quiet because we all knew it was true. Rose Harbor wasn't merely walls and windows. It was the beginning of 100 second chances. Mine, Emily's, Ruth's, Daniel's, and perhaps yours. So if you're reading this or listening in your own quiet corner, wondering if anyone would ever open a door for you again, know this. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be polished. You don't have to match anyone's aesthetic. You just have to keep going. Because somewhere a door is waiting to swing wide. And on the other side, someone is ready to say the words that changed everything for me. Welcome home. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and please Share your own story in the comments. Your voice matters.